There is a photograph taken in 1975 that tells you almost everything you need to know. In it, a group of white British men, businessmen, diplomats, are being carried through the streets of Kampala in a sedan chair. They are smiling, uncomfortably, the way men smile when they are not sure if they have a choice. The man who ordered this spectacle stands nearby, dressed in full military regalia, his chest buried under a staggering collection of medals, some awarded by foreign governments, some, apparently, awarded by himself. He is enormous. He is grinning. And he is watching. His name is Idi Amin Dada. At that moment, he held the official title of President for Life, Field Marshal, VC, DSO, MC, and in a declaration he made himself conqueror of the British Empire. He had also recently announced that he was the rightful king of Scotland. None of this was a joke. Or rather, it was impossible to tell whether it was a joke. And that ambiguity, that permanent uncertainty about what was performance and what was threat, was perhaps the most dangerous thing about him. Between 1971 and 1979, Idi Amin ruled Uganda. In that time, the country's economy collapsed, its institutions were gutted, its most productive citizens were expelled, and somewhere between 80,000 and 500,000 people were killed. The estimates vary wildly, which itself tells you something about how thoroughly the historical record was destroyed. He was not a mystery, exactly. But he was a contradiction. A man of almost supernatural personal charisma who used that charisma to terrorize an entire nation. A man with almost no formal education who outmaneuvered trained politicians, generals, and foreign governments for 8 years. A man who claimed to love Uganda so deeply that he destroyed it. This is not a story about a monster, though monstrous things happened. It is a story about how power works, how it finds the cracks in broken systems, how it rewards certain personalities and destroys others, how a man can rise from almost nothing to command the attention of the entire world. And it is a story about what happens when that power finally runs out. So let's go back. Back before the medals and the sedan chairs and the disappearances. Back to a boy growing up in the margins of a colonial world that had decided, before he was even born, exactly how much his life was worth. Idi Amin was born somewhere around 1925. The uncertainty there is not accidental. In the rural communities of northern Uganda's West Nile region, birth records were inconsistently kept, and Amin himself would later give contradictory accounts of his own age, sometimes by several years. What is known is this. He was born into the Kakwa ethnic group, a small Muslim community in what was then the northwestern corner of the British Protectorate of Uganda. His father, Andreas Nyabayer, had converted from Catholicism to Islam around the time of Amin's birth. His mother, Asa At, was a woman who would later be described as a healer and herbalist, a figure of local spiritual significance in her community. His parents separated when he was young. His mother took him and moved, eventually settling in Lugatsi, a town in central Uganda. Then Kampala. Then, later, around the military barracks of the King's African Rifles, the British Colonial Army unit where his mother found work and where, it seems, the young Amin first encountered a world organized around rank, discipline, uniforms, and the performance of authority. That detail matters more than it might seem. Uganda in the 1930s and 1940s was a place in which the social order was almost entirely constructed by the British. The King's African Rifles were an explicit expression of that order. African soldiers, commanded by British officers, trained in British military culture, deployed to enforce British colonial interests across East Africa. The army was a world of clear hierarchies, of visible power, of men who were obeyed because of what they wore and where they stood. For a boy growing up without a father, moving from place to place, with no particular inherited status, this world would have been both alienating and instructive. Amin had almost no formal schooling. Later accounts suggest he attended a few years of primary education, possibly at a missionary school, but never progressed beyond that. For the rest of his life, he would be functionally semi-literate, capable of basic reading and writing, but unable to engage seriously with written documents, policy papers, or the administrative machinery of government. He would compensate for this in ways that were sometimes brilliant and sometimes catastrophic. He enlisted in the King's African Rifles in 1946. He was, by most accounts, around 20 years old. And here is where the story gets interesting, because Amin was not just another recruit. He was exceptional in ways that the colonial military immediately recognized and immediately limited. He was physically extraordinary. Standing somewhere between 6'2" and 6'4", weighing well over 200 pounds, he was an intimidating physical presence in any context. He was an exceptional swimmer, a light heavyweight boxing champion across the East African region for a period in the 1950s, and by most accounts, a natural leader in the field. Brave, decisive, someone whom other soldiers naturally followed. The British officers who commanded him noticed. They promoted him. They used him. And they gave him, within the strict limits of the colonial system, as much responsibility as that system would permit, which is to say, not much. The highest rank an African soldier could hold in the King's African Rifles in the early 1950s was that of Effendi, a sort of warrant officer grade below commissioned officer rank, which was reserved entirely for Europeans. Amin rose to that rank. And then the system, as designed, stopped him. This is the first of several places in this story where we have to ask a question that does not have a clean answer. How much of what Amin became was shaped by the colonial system that formed him, and how much was something else, something personal, something psychological, something that would have expressed itself no matter what world he had been born into? The colonial military gave Amin a framework for understanding the world. Power was physical, loyalty was transactional, rank was everything, and violence was a legitimate tool of order. It also showed him, with complete clarity, that the system was rigged, that no matter how strong you were, no matter how capable, there was a ceiling built specifically for people like him. In 1962, Uganda became independent. That ceiling collapsed overnight. And Idi Amin was suddenly in a world that had not quite figured out what to do with men like him. Uganda's independence came fast, as independence across Africa came fast in the early 1960s, faster in many cases than either the departing colonial powers or the emerging national governments were fully prepared for. The man who led Uganda to independence was Milton Obote, a politician from the Lango ethnic group in northern Uganda, educated, articulate, a skilled organizer who had built a coalition that could win elections. Obote became prime minister, and then, after a constitutional restructuring in 1966, president. He needed an army. And specifically, he needed an army loyal to him. This is where Idi Amin becomes essential, and where the relationship that would eventually destroy both men begins. Obote recognized in Amin something useful. Here was a man of formidable physical presence and genuine military ability, who had risen as far as the colonial system allowed, who had a natural following among soldiers, and who, crucially, was not a member of Obote's own Lango ethnic group. In the complex ethnic calculus of Ugandan politics, an ally from a different group, particularly from the smaller Kakwa community of the Northwest, could be deployed in ways that a fellow Lango could not. He was useful precisely because he was not a rival within the ethnic networks that mattered most. Obote promoted Amin rapidly. By 1964, Amin was a colonel. By 1966, a general. By 1970, commander of the army. But Obote made a mistake that leaders who use dangerous men have made throughout history. He assumed that Amin's loyalty could be managed. That a man of Amin's background, limited education, no independent political base, no foreign allies, could be elevated and then controlled. He was wrong about almost all of it. Over the course of the late 1960s, as Amin consolidated his position in the army, Troubling signs began to accumulate. There were allegations that Amin had been involved in extrajudicial killings during counterinsurgency operations in northern Uganda, operations conducted against a rebel group called the Enyanya, which was fighting for the independence of South Sudan. There were rumors of financial irregularities, of weapons being diverted, of gold being smuggled from the Congo. Obote's government launched an investigation. By early 1971, the relationship between Obote and Amin had deteriorated to the point where both men understood that the situation could not continue. Obote, attending a Commonwealth summit in Singapore, was reportedly preparing to arrest Amin upon his return to Uganda. Amin moved first. On the night of January 24 to 25, 1971, units loyal to Amin seized control of the radio station in Kampala, the airport, and the key military installations around the capital. The coup was swift, efficiently organized, and largely bloodless in its initial hours, at least as far as the civilian population could tell. Obote, in Singapore, learned what had happened and went into exile rather than attempt an immediate return. Amin appeared on state radio the following morning. His message was simple. He spoke of chaos under Obote, of corruption, of suffering. He promised free elections. He promised the return of Obote's predecessor, the Kabaka, the king of Buganda, the largest traditional kingdom in Uganda, who had died in exile in London after Obote abolished the traditional monarchies in 1967. He would release political prisoners. He would restore order. And here is the uncomfortable truth. In those first days, many Ugandans were genuinely glad. Obote had not been a beloved leader. His government had been authoritarian in its own right, increasingly reliant on detention without trial, suppression of political opposition, and the privileging of his own Lango ethnic group within government. The Buganda people, the largest ethnic group in the country, centered around Kampala, had particular reason to resent him after the abolition of their kingdom. For the international community, the initial response was similarly cautious but not hostile. Britain was among the first countries to recognize the new government. Israel maintained warm relations. Even the United States, then deeply invested in Cold War calculations about African alignment, took a wait-and-see approach. This initial goodwill was not entirely manufactured. In those first weeks, some political prisoners were indeed released. Amin held press conferences, took questions, joked with journalists. He was charming in a way that surprised people who had expected a military strongman to be stiff and grim. He was funny, self-deprecating, sometimes accessible. The question that nobody quite knew how to answer in those early months of 1971 was this: was Idi Amin a blunt instrument, a soldier who had stumbled into power and would, with the right guidance, govern reasonably, or was something else already in motion, something that the charm and the jokes and the promises were designed to obscure? The answer came faster than most people expected. Within weeks of the coup, the killings began. They started inside the army itself. Soldiers who had been loyal to Obote, particularly those from the Akoli and Lango ethnic groups, which were strongly represented in the military and closely associated with the previous regime, began to disappear. Some were arrested. Some were killed in what were described officially as escape attempts or armed resistance. Many simply vanished. The numbers are difficult to establish precisely. Human rights investigators who examined the period later estimated that somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 soldiers were killed in the first year of Amin's rule, many of them during the consolidation of control over the army in the weeks following the coup. The Malire Mechanized Regiment, which had been particularly loyal to Obote, was essentially destroyed. This was not random violence. It was systematic and purposeful, the removal of anyone within the army who might form the nucleus of a counter-coup. Amin understood, with the clarity that comes from having spent his entire life watching how power actually works, that the most dangerous threat to a coup leader is always another coup leader. The army had to be remade in his image, loyal not to the institution but to him personally. To replace those he had purged, Amin elevated men from the Kakwa, Lugbara, and Nubian ethnic communities, groups that were numerically small and geographically peripheral, which meant they were dependent on Amin's patronage in ways that men from larger, more established communities were not. He also brought in Sudanese and Congolese mercenaries, men with no roots in Uganda at all, whose loyalty was entirely transactional. Outside the army, Amin constructed what scholars of authoritarian regimes would recognize as a classic loyalty network. Government positions were distributed based on personal connection, ethnic affiliation, and demonstrated willingness to comply. Ministers who questioned decisions found themselves replaced, or worse. Ambassadors who sent critical reports were recalled. Judges who issued inconvenient rulings were removed. The instrument of this control was primarily fear. And the instrument of that fear was a succession of security services, each more brutal than the last. The most notorious of these was the State Research Bureau, established in 1971. In theory, it was an intelligence organization. In practice, it became a mechanism for the disappearance and killing of people deemed to be enemies of the regime. Real opponents, imagined opponents, rivals, inconveniences, people who owned property Amin wanted, people who had simply been denounced by someone with better access to power. The Bureau operated out of a building on Nakasero Hill in Kampala, and its reputation was such that being summoned there, or simply being seen near it, was enough to cause terror. Testimony from survivors who were brought there described systematic torture and killing. The bodies of victims were sometimes dumped in the Nile, sometimes buried in mass graves that investigators began to discover after the regime ended, sometimes simply never found at all. It is important to say clearly what we know and what we do not know. The existence of the State Research Bureau and its role in killings is documented. The participation of specific individuals in specific acts is less well established. The Bureau was deliberately designed to obscure accountability, to diffuse responsibility so that no single person could be definitively linked to a specific death. This was not an accident. It was a feature. What is also documented is the way in which Amin managed public perception during this period. He was extraordinarily media-savvy in a way that repeatedly surprised observers who expected a semi-literate former soldier to be clumsy with the press. He gave frequent interviews. He made outrageous statements, claiming to have written a love letter to Queen Elizabeth, declaring himself a military genius superior to Hitler, announcing that he had defeated the British Empire, that simultaneously generated global attention and made it difficult for anyone to assess how serious he was. This was not stupidity. It may have been a form of genius. By making himself a figure of ridicule as well as fear, Amin occupied a strange middle ground in international coverage. He was simultaneously mocked and taken seriously, laughed at and dreaded. This ambiguity protected him. It made sustained, serious opposition harder to organize, because nobody could quite decide what register to engage him in. Meanwhile, inside Uganda, the purges continued. The judiciary was undermined. Amin expelled the Chief Justice in 1972 after receiving unfavorable rulings and replaced him with loyalists. The press was brought to heel through a combination of threats, expulsions of foreign journalists, and the occasional disappearance of local reporters who pushed too hard. The Archbishop of Uganda, Janani Luwum, was killed in 1977. The official account described an automobile accident. The unofficial account, supported by considerable evidence including the condition of his body, suggested otherwise. His death sent a chill through every sector of Ugandan society. If a prominent religious leader, widely respected, with international connections, was not safe, then nobody was. By the mid-1970s, the Uganda that had celebrated in the streets in January 1971 had become a place of profound and pervasive fear. The economy was beginning to unravel. The most educated and skilled Ugandans were leaving, those who could. And the event that perhaps did more than any other to change Uganda's trajectory was already in motion. On August 4, 1972, Idi Amin announced that he had received a message from God. The message, he said, instructed him to expel Uganda's Asian population, approximately 80,000 people, most of them Ugandan citizens of South Asian descent, many of whom were the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of laborers brought to East Africa by the British in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. They had 90 days to leave. The Asian community in Uganda had built much of the country's commercial and professional infrastructure over generations. They owned a significant proportion of the country's shops, factories, and businesses. They were doctors, engineers, lawyers, accountants. In economic terms, they represented a disproportionate share of Uganda's productive capacity. Amin's announcement was met with horror internationally and with a complicated mixture of reactions domestically. There was genuine popular resentment of the Asian community in some quarters, the product of colonial policies that had, deliberately, positioned Asians as an intermediate commercial class between European rulers and African laborers, creating economic and social tensions that independence had done nothing to resolve. Amin was tapping into something real. But tapping into something real does not mean solving it correctly. The expulsion was a catastrophe. The businesses and properties abandoned by expelled Asians were distributed to Amin loyalists, army officers, political allies, members of favored ethnic groups, most of whom had no experience running commercial enterprises. Within months, many of the businesses had failed. Factories sat idle. Supply chains collapsed. The shops that had stocked Ugandan towns with basic goods were empty. Uganda's GDP declined by as much as 20% in the years following the expulsion. The foreign exchange earnings that had sustained the government's ability to import fuel, medicines, and machinery evaporated. Inflation surged. Shortages became endemic. Internationally, the expulsion damaged Uganda's relationships with Britain, where most expelled Ugandan Asians ultimately resettled, causing a diplomatic and social crisis of its own, and with several other countries that had relied on Uganda as a relatively stable regional economy. Israel, which had maintained close security ties with Uganda since independence, found its relationship with Amin changing rapidly in this period as Amin pivoted toward new allies. Because here is where Amin's foreign policy, if it can be called that, becomes genuinely strange. Amin turned toward Muammar Gaddafi's Libya. He turned toward the Palestine Liberation Organization. He declared, with spectacular timing, that Adolf Hitler had been right to kill Jewish people, a statement that caused international outrage and that was widely interpreted as an attempt to position Uganda within a particular axis of radical Third World politics. He erected a monument to Hitler in Kampala. He wore a kilt and declared himself the King of Scotland. He sent a telegram to Richard Nixon during the Watergate crisis offering his sympathy. Each of these acts served a purpose, or at least each of them can be analyzed as serving a purpose. The anti-Israel, pro-Palestinian pivot secured Libyan funding at a moment when Uganda's economy was collapsing and its other international relationships were fraying. The outrageous statements generated international attention that could be managed in ways that serious political opposition could not. The self-aggrandizement, the medals, the titles, the constant performance of his own power, projected an image of invincibility to domestic audiences. In 1975, Amin became chairman of the Organization of African Unity, a body representing the independent nations of Africa, an appointment that gave him a continent-wide platform and a degree of legitimacy that his domestic conduct should, by any reasonable measure, have precluded. His chairmanship was deeply uncomfortable for many African leaders who were simultaneously committed to the principle of African solidarity and appalled by what was happening in Uganda. The year 1976 produced one of the defining moments of his rule, and one of the moments that would begin the final unraveling. In June 1976, an Air France flight was hijacked by Palestinian militants and German left-wing extremists and diverted to Entebbe Airport in Uganda. Amin welcomed the hijackers, allowed them to use the airport as their base, and appeared publicly with them, positioning himself as a mediator while the hijackers held over 100 Israeli and Jewish passengers hostage. A week later, on July 4, 1976, Israeli commandos flew 4,000 kilometers, landed at Entebbe in the middle of the night, killed the hijackers, freed the hostages, and were gone within an hour. The entire operation took approximately 90 minutes on the ground. The humiliation was total. Amin's military reputation, his image as a powerful and strategically significant figure, his role as the man who had outwitted the great powers, all of it was punctured by an operation that treated Uganda as though it were an obstacle rather than a sovereign state. 3 hostages died in the operation. The Israeli commander, Lieutenant Colonel Yonatan Netanyahu, the older brother of the future Israeli Prime Minister, was killed. Ugandan soldiers guarding the airport were also killed. The Entebbe raid did not end Amin's regime, but it changed something. A figure who had managed to appear simultaneously comic and dangerous, ridiculous and threatening, began to seem more simply dangerous without the compensation of actual power. The emperor had been exposed. At some point in any examination of Idi Amin, the question becomes unavoidable. How do we explain him? The temptation, which this script will resist, is to reach for a clinical diagnosis, to say that Amin was a psychopath or a narcissist or suffered from some specific psychiatric condition, and to use that label as an explanation. This is tempting because it provides closure. It moves him outside the range of normal human psychology and makes him a special case, an aberration, something that doesn't require us to examine the systems that produced him. But the evidence suggests something more complex and more troubling. Start with what we know about how Amin operated. He was not impulsive in the way that word is usually understood. The coup of 1971 was carefully planned and precisely executed. The purges of the army that followed were systematic and strategic. The expulsion of the Asians, whatever its consequences, was a politically calculated move that served specific short-term goals. The cultivation of Libyan funding, the chairmanship of the OAU, the management of international press, these were not random acts. At the same time, there are documented instances of decisions that appear to have been made on the basis of dream visions, divine messages, or sudden impulses. The expulsion announcement was famously attributed to a message from God received while sleeping. Appointments and dismissals sometimes occurred with no apparent strategic logic. Purges swept up people who posed no conceivable threat. How do we hold these things together? One framework that some historians have found useful is to distinguish between Amin's tactical intelligence, which was genuine and considerable, and his strategic intelligence, which was severely limited. He was exceptionally good at the immediate problem. The problem of survival, the problem of managing a room, the problem of identifying and neutralizing a specific threat. He was much less capable of the longer-term thinking required to actually govern, to build institutions, to develop economic policy, to manage international relationships over time. This gap between tactical brilliance and strategic incompetence is not unusual in figures who rise through violence rather than through institutions. The skills that get you to the top of a violent hierarchy are not the same skills that allow you to govern a complex society. Then there is the question of the myth-making. Amin was a relentless self-inventor. The medals he wore, many of them genuine awards from real military service, others self-bestowed, the titles, the declarations, the outrageous public statements, the kilt, the telegram to Nixon, these were not simply vanity. They were a coherent, if strange, strategy for occupying public consciousness. A leader who generates enough noise, enough spectacle, enough sheer absurdity, is harder to focus opposition against. The satire writes itself, and satire, as authoritarian rulers have understood for centuries, is safer than serious political organizing. There is also a colonial legacy here that is worth taking seriously. The British military tradition in which Amin was formed was deeply invested in the performance of authority. The uniform, the medal, the parade, the title. Amin took that performance and expanded it to Baroque proportions, but the underlying logic, that visible symbols of rank constitute power, was not something he invented. He learned it from the same system that taught him everything else. The question of charisma is also important, and uncomfortable. By virtually all accounts from people who encountered him, Amin was extraordinarily charismatic in person. Journalists who went to interview him expecting a terrifying tyrant often came away describing someone who was funny, warm, physically impressive, capable of making the people around him feel seen and valued. This charisma was not a mask worn over malevolence. It was a genuine quality, which is precisely what makes it disturbing. Because what it suggests is that the capacity for great warmth and the capacity for great cruelty were not opposites in Amin. They were two modes of the same instrument. The question was not whether you were experiencing the warmth or the cruelty. The question was whether you were useful. And that is perhaps the most chilling thing about him. By 1978, Uganda was a country in freefall. The economic consequences of the Asian expulsion had worked their way through every sector of society. Foreign exchange reserves were essentially depleted. The country's infrastructure, roads, hospitals, schools, the electrical grid, had deteriorated for lack of maintenance. The coffee crop, Uganda's primary export, was still being harvested, but the marketing board was paralyzed by corruption and mismanagement, and the farmers received a fraction of the commodity's world price. International isolation had deepened. The United States had cut off most aid following documented human rights abuses. Britain's relationship with Uganda was poisoned by the expulsion crisis and by the ongoing treatment of Ugandan citizens. Even Libya's support, which had partially compensated for the loss of other Western backing, was becoming more conditional. Inside the government, Amin's inner circle had contracted to the point of dysfunction. The constant purges, which had never really stopped, had removed virtually everyone with genuine expertise or independent standing. What remained was a group of people whose primary qualification was demonstrated personal loyalty, and who had been selected for exactly that quality rather than for any administrative or technical competence. The army, similarly, had been purged and purged again until its organizational coherence was severely degraded. Units that had been rebuilt after each round of purges were unreliable, loyal not to the institution or the nation but to whichever individual had most recently distributed resources and protection. In October 1978, Amin made the decision that would end his regime. Ugandan forces crossed the border into Tanzania and seized the Kagera region, a strip of Tanzanian territory north of the Kagera River. The stated justification was murky. Amin claimed Tanzania had been supporting Ugandan exiles plotting against him, which was true, but the military action was disproportionate and strategically inexplicable. Some analysts have suggested it was an attempt to distract the Ugandan population from domestic misery with a foreign military adventure. Others have suggested it was, more simply, a blunder, a decision made without adequate military planning or understanding of the consequences. Tanzania's President Julius Nyerere was not a man who accepted territorial incursion quietly. Nyerere was one of the most respected figures in African politics, a genuine intellectual, a founding father of the Organization of African Unity, a man with deep moral credibility across the continent. He had been a consistent critic of Amin since the 1971 coup, having refused to recognize the new government and having provided sanctuary to Ugandan exiles, including Obote. Nyerere mobilized the Tanzanian People's Defense Force. He also reached out to the Uganda National Liberation Army, a coalition of Ugandan exile groups that had been organizing in Tanzania, representing a broad range of Ugandan political factions united primarily by their opposition to Amin. What followed was not really a war in the conventional sense. It was a slow-motion collapse. The Tanzanian forces, with their Ugandan exile allies, crossed the border in early 1979. The Ugandan army, which should have been able to defend its own territory, fell apart. Units surrendered, deserted, or fled. Amin requested and received military support from Libya. Gaddafi sent troops and equipment, but the intervention was disorganized and ultimately ineffective. The Libyan soldiers, unfamiliar with the terrain and unclear about their mission, were not a significant factor. Town by town, the coalition forces moved northward. Masaka, Barara, Entebbe. Amin made several public broadcasts claiming that the invasion was being repelled, that Uganda was winning, that the enemy was retreating. The broadcasts became increasingly disconnected from events on the ground. This, too, was a recognizable pattern. The authoritarian leader whose information environment had been so thoroughly controlled that he was receiving only the intelligence his subordinates thought he wanted to hear, and who had, in any case, destroyed the institutions that might have given him accurate assessments. On April 11, 1979, Tanzanian and exile forces entered Kampala. Idi Amin was not there. He had fled. First to Jinja, then northeast, to Arua near the Sudanese border, then to Libya, where Gaddafi provided temporary shelter, and then, within a few months, to the place where he would spend the rest of his life, Saudi Arabia. The regime that had, depending on which estimate you use, killed between 80,000 and 500,000 people, expelled 80,000 more, and reduced one of East Africa's most potentially prosperous nations to economic ruin, had ended not with a dramatic last stand or a dramatic capture, but with a drive to the airport and a flight into the night. Idi Amin spent the rest of his life in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. The Saudi government's decision to provide him sanctuary was not, exactly, a surprise. Saudi Arabia had a long-standing practice of offering refuge to deposed leaders and exiled royalty. It was a form of soft diplomacy, a demonstration of reliability to leaders across the Muslim world. Amin was a Muslim. He had cultivated the relationship with the Saudi government throughout his presidency, making the Hajj pilgrimage, presenting himself as a defender of Islamic identity in East Africa. In Jeddah, by most accounts, Amin lived reasonably well. He had a large house, access to resources, and, according to people who encountered him during this period, he maintained the same physical presence and personal force that had characterized him in power. He was reported to be a regular at local restaurants, recognizable to residents of Jeddah, occasionally photographed in public. He gave almost no interviews. When he did speak, he denied the killings attributed to his regime, claimed to have been a good president who had done his best for Uganda, and expressed a desire to return home. He never returned. No extradition request from Uganda was ever seriously pursued, and no international tribunal was convened to examine his case. This is one of the most troubling aspects of his legacy. Not just that he escaped accountability, but that the escape was so comprehensive and so unremarkable. The contrast with other figures associated with mass atrocities in the same era, figures who were tried, convicted, imprisoned, is stark. The International Criminal Court did not exist in the form it now does. The political will to pursue an African leader into Saudi exile was limited. And Uganda itself, in the chaotic years following liberation, was focused on survival rather than justice. The question of how many people died under Amin's rule remains genuinely contested. The International Commission of Jurists estimated 100,000 deaths. Amnesty International's estimates ranged higher. Some researchers have placed the figure at 300,000. Others, accounting for violence in remote regions that was never systematically documented, have suggested 500,000. The wide range itself reflects a reality. Amin's government destroyed records, made documentation dangerous, and operated in ways specifically designed to obscure accountability. Idi Amin died on August 16, 2003, in King Faisal Hospital in Jeddah. The cause of death was reported as multiple organ failure. He was in his late 70s. He had been in a coma for several weeks before his death. His family requested permission to bury him in Uganda. The Ugandan government declined. He was buried in Jeddah. There was no trial. There was no formal accounting. There was no moment at which Idi Amin stood before a court and heard the evidence of what had been done under his rule read back to him. The men and women who lost family members to the State Research Bureau, who were expelled from their homes with 90 days' notice, who survived torture, who fled into exile, none of them received the verdict that such survivors are typically owed. This absence is not a footnote. It is part of the story. Uganda today is a different country from the one Idi Amin left behind in 1979. It is also, in some important ways, the same country. The immediate aftermath of Amin's fall was not the peaceful restoration the liberation forces had hoped for. Milton Obote, the man Amin had overthrown, returned to power in 1980 elections that were widely considered fraudulent, and his second administration was marked by its own severe human rights abuses, particularly in the Luro Triangle region north of Kampala, where counterinsurgency operations caused tens of thousands of civilian deaths. Uganda's political instability, the coups, the violence, the institutional collapse, did not begin with Amin and did not end with him. But his 8 years in power accelerated and deepened structural damage that Uganda is still working to repair. The professional and commercial class that was expelled in 1972 was slowly invited to return after his fall, and many Ugandan Asians did return. But the human capital, the institutional knowledge, the professional networks, these do not simply snap back. The economic damage of the Amin years, the destroyed infrastructure, the gutted state-owned enterprises, the foreign exchange crisis, the loss of international investment confidence, required decades to address. Uganda's economy did not recover to its 1970 levels until well into the 1990s. And there is a deeper damage, harder to quantify. The systematic destruction of Uganda's judiciary, civil service, university system, and professional institutions, the killing and expulsion of judges, civil servants, academics, doctors, and engineers, left the country dependent on rebuilding those institutions almost from scratch. Institutions take generations to build. They can be destroyed in years. Then there is the question of how Amin is remembered, globally and within Uganda, and why that question matters. Internationally, Amin has become a strange kind of cultural figure. Films have been made about him, most famously The Last King of Scotland, in which Forrest Whitaker won an Academy Award for his portrayal. The character in that film is compelling, terrifying, and fully human in ways that pure demonization would not permit. The film made a choice to show Amin's charisma, his warmth toward those he favored, his genuine complexity, that was both artistically valid and, in some ways, uncomfortable for the Ugandan survivors of his regime, for whom the word complexity can feel like a euphemism for the suffering he caused. Within Uganda, the memory of Amin is more complicated than outside observers sometimes assume. For some, he is simply a figure of horror, the man who destroyed families, gutted the economy, and set the country back by decades. For others, particularly among communities that felt marginalized by the Obote government, there remains a complicated ambivalence, a memory of the initial jubilation of 1971 that sits uneasily alongside the knowledge of what followed. There are also those who focus on the structural rather than the individual, who point out that Amin did not appear from nowhere, that the colonial system that formed him bears responsibility for what he became, that the British government that recognized his coup in 1971 and only withdrew support slowly and reluctantly enabled his early years, that the Cold War calculus that led various great powers to prioritize strategic alignment over human rights gave him room to operate that should not have been given. None of this diminishes his responsibility, but it expands the frame in ways that are necessary for understanding rather than simply judging. What does the story of Idi Amin tell us that is worth carrying forward? It tells us something about the fragility of institutions, about how quickly the structures that constrain power can be dismantled when the people inside them are afraid enough, or compliant enough, or simply absent. Uganda's army, judiciary, civil service, and press did not collapse because they were inherently weak. They collapsed because they were systematically attacked by someone who understood exactly how they worked and exactly which points to strike. It tells us something about international complicity, about how readily governments and institutions that should have known better chose engagement over accountability, convenience over principle, and managed the resulting discomfort by treating a mass atrocity regime as an eccentricity rather than a crisis. It tells us something about charisma, about how the qualities that make a leader compelling are not the qualities that make them good, and about the danger of confusing the two. And it tells us something about accountability. Idi Amin died in bed, in a hospital, in a comfortable exile, without ever having stood trial for anything. The Ugandan people who suffered under his rule, the families of those who disappeared into the State Research Bureau, the expelled Asians who rebuilt their lives in Britain and Canada and elsewhere, the soldiers massacred in the army purges, the journalists and lawyers and judges who were killed for doing their jobs, none of them received the formal reckoning that justice requires. That absence is not just a legal failure. It is a wound in the historical record, a place where the story should have a chapter that it does not have, where the process of public acknowledgement that societies need after mass violence was denied. Uganda has survived. It has, against considerable odds, built functioning institutions, a growing economy, a civil society that is imperfect but real. The country that Amin tried to reduce to a personal possession, his own fiefdom, run by his own loyalists, organized around his own survival, has refused to remain that. Its people refuse to remain that. But the question that Amin's story leaves hanging, the question about what systems produce such men, about what international order permits them to survive, about what accountability means when it comes too late or not at all, that question does not have an ending. It is still being written. Idi Amin was born at the margins of an empire that did not think his life was worth very much. He died at the center of a comfort that the empire of his own creation had purchased with the lives of tens of thousands of people he had sworn to serve. Between those two facts lies the history of a nation, a continent, a colonial system, and a Cold War. Lies the history of what power does when it is not constrained. What fear does when it is systematically organized. What a country can lose in 8 years that takes generations to rebuild. His full self-appointed title, toward the end of his rule, was His Excellency, President for Life, Field Marshal Al-Haji Dr. Idi Amin Dada, VC, DSO, MC, Lord of all the beasts of the earth and fishes of the seas and conqueror of the British Empire in Africa in general and Uganda in particular. Uganda is still here. He is buried in Jeddah.